I got like this laser thing. This is so cool. Okay. So how many of you walked up 10 flights of stairs to get here? Very nice. All of you get bonus points. You will get double the tickets for this here unicorn, which eventually we're going to steal from Yelp at the end of tonight. All right, cool. So thank you for coming. So we're going to talk about HTML5 feature detection and fallback. I think an alternate title for this talk is that shiny things can break really easily. This is something we learned as children. I remember once breaking this ceramic bird that was my dad's, and I was like crying for hours, like, Dad, I broke your shiny bird. But then I learned about hot glue. And somehow I thought that my hot glued together bird was just as pretty as when it started. And it turns out it wasn't. But okay, childhood aside. So here's the thing, HTML5, there are a ton of new features, right? Sometimes like Friday nights, you know, when I'm bored and not getting any, I browse the HTML5 spec and see what new things there are, right? And then I make animated GIFs of it. So you can see we've got new image formats. We've got lots of new CSS stuff. You've got big things like web workers. You've got form input types. You've got fonts. You have so many things. There's no way I could go through all of these, right? So you look at these and you start drooling, right? Especially on Friday nights. And you're like, oh, wow. That's amazing. This is the sort of stuff I've wanted for years of being a web developer, toiling alone in my, my work on Friday night. However, the thing about all these features is that they're not all available now, right? So when are they available? Here's a quote from the WhatWig FAQ, because they commonly got this question: when will HTML5 be finished? When do I get to use it, right? And their answer now is basically never. They say it is now considered a living standard, which means it's kind of like asking when will humans ever be finally evolved. We are a living standard, slowly getting worse. So it's really not about when HTML5 is finished. It's about when can you use that particular HTML5 feature, right? So we have to look at it as a feature-by-feature basis because browsers are implementing it each feature at a time, right? And then there's like sub-features of sub-features of sub-features, right? So if we look at, what is it that browsers support now? Here's some visualizations based on caniuse.com, which show us, what the kind of support is like for things across many browsers. And this is also an animated GIF, so let's just reload it here. There you go. So you can see across many different features, you can see the circles, represent the different browsers and their versions, right? So any different element you click on, it has a very different browser support, right? There's not one that is supported in every single thing.
Do you know on caniuse.com and just yourself, how do you keep track of what's coming out and what's supported? Where do they get all the information from? How do you?
Okay, so the question is, how do you actually keep track of this stuff? So they are paying attention to the specs, and there's new specs coming out every week. So you pay attention to the specs, and you pay attention to the browser release notes, all right? So I actually think the best way to do this is just to go to cooperpress.com and sign up for the HTML5 Weekly and the JavaScript Weekly. And every week it'll have a summary of the latest browser releases and the latest specs. And they're really good at keeping on top of that, right? So you see we've got quite the varied browser support for every different feature, right? So that means that if we're approaching HTML5 and we're thinking about a feature, we need a strategy to approach that, right? So the first thing you need to do is research and find out what browsers does this thing actually work in, right? The second thing is you have to figure out, all right, assuming that it doesn't work in all browsers, how am I going to know if it works in the particular user's browser, right? Because then once you know that, you have to decide on a fallback. So, okay, if it doesn't work in someone's browser, what is my fallback strategy going to be, right? Will I use some inferior technology? Will I show a message, etc.? So we'll go into details on each of these steps, right? So in the research step, figuring out what browsers it works on, there's actually quite a few resources, right? So the one I just mentioned is caniuse.com, and that's kind of my go-to. But caniuse.com, it's maintained kind of, I think, by just one person. It means that it's not always, it doesn't have every single thing in it, because there are so many things in HTML5 to keep track of. So if it is here, go here first. But there's a lot of other places too. There's some things specifically about CSS, specifically about CSS on mobile, specifically about HTML5 on mobile, specifically about ECMAScript 5, right? So I'm kind of lumping ECMAScript 5 into HTML5 and CSS3 because it's all things that we might be thinking about using. And for those who don't know, ECMAScript is the standard that drives JavaScript, and ECMAScript 5 and 6 are the things that the next versions of JavaScript are based on, right? And there's all these like really cool features coming out in those too. So go to those sites and also pay attention to the notes. So on these sites, you actually see, like on caniuse.com, you see here the notes section. Notes section and known issues, really, really important. Don't ignore those, right? Because a lot of times there's subtleties to the sport. It's like, yeah, it works, but. And that but becomes really important when you've got hundreds of users going, it doesn't work. And you're like, oh, I should have really read the but, right? So pay attention to any notes because those are the things that are really going to bite you.
And are you or somebody running automated tests against the new browsers and nightlies?
So yeah, the question is somebody running automated tests against the browsers and nightlies? Probably. maybe PBK is. I'd have to ask them and see if they are. It would seem like a very clever thing to do. Probably PPK does for his mobile compatibility chart. So then we move on to detection, right? So how do we know if a particular feature works? And we have a couple of different strategies for this. So the first obvious way is feature detection, right? So the way we detect a feature is like we kind of ask the browser like, hey, is this feature in you, right? So if we're doing something like JavaScript APIs, for JavaScript APIs, we'll say something like, okay, you know, is this global variable WebKit audio context, is that defined on window, right? So we assume that if the browser supports it, it then defines it. And so you may have the prefixed version and then maybe an unprefixed version for checking on supporting audio. Then for checking if new HTML elements are supported, you might try and like create them and then see if a particular attribute is defined, or this example here is showing creating an SVG element and then checking to see if the namespace gets set on it. That's kind of more advanced for checking HTML elements. For CSS, you could actually try and create an element and check to see if that element by default has that CSS property defined on it. But really, we don't want to be figuring out how to detect features for every single thing we do. So browsers are working on a standard way to support, to give you feature detection, because all those things are kind of things we're making up, right? So one of the cool things that they're doing is something called CSS Conditionals, and there is a spec about this if you enjoy reading specs. And so what that'll be is that you can actually, in your CSS, you can say @supports, and if the browser supports that, it'll then execute the rule inside that, right? So that's pretty cool. It means you could serve some rules based on whether it passes this @supports, kind of like how we would with media queries. And we can also access this via JavaScript. So we can say, OK, all right, if it supports this CSS, then we're going to do some stuff as well, right? So this is pretty cool. This is in a couple browsers now, Opera, Chrome, Firefox. So you can start to try to use it, but it's not in all browsers, right? So it's not something we use for everything, and it's only for CSS, right? So what should you really be using for feature detection is...
and this detects like with the WebKit prefix and without the prefix involved?
Does it detect with and without prefixes? Probably, yeah. Yeah, I probably would. I'd recommend reading the spec. I didn't actually write the spec, so I haven't memorized all of it yet. I started reading the ECMAScript spec last night. That's a good one. So I got really excited at the beginning because there was like this diagram of how it's like a prototype-based language, and you like follow the prototypes along, and I was like, oh, this is so cool, it's like a children's book. And then I kept going, and there were no more diagrams. I was like, what happened? Come on. I thought this was going to be a picture book. What's up? OK, so here's the thing, right? So you do all that feature detection stuff, and you can be like, oh, I wonder, this is how I'd detect this, right? But do not reinvent the wheel. There are so many people out there reinventing the wheel, and it's silly because there's like billions of web developers in San Francisco alone. I've done the stats. And there are people there who have already figured out how to detect what it is that you're trying to detect. And most of them have actually put it into the Modernizer library, right? So the Modernizer library is a community open source project with a lot of contributions from very smart people who are trying to figure out what's the best way to support a particular feature, right? So when I'm thinking about doing some feature detection, I go straight to Modernizer, right? And you can, for Modernizer, you can use it a couple different ways. You could actually include a script tag. And then once you do that, Modernizers will automatically run all these tests, and then it'll add class names to your HTML tag. And it will also add JS properties to a global, right? So that means for the class names, if you wanted to do something based on SVG support, you could just say, oh, if the HTML tag has SVG on it, that means it supports it, and then you can serve this rule, right? Or in JavaScript, you can just say, oh, if modernizer.svg or if modernizer.touch, right? That's one way or two ways of using it. The other way that I use Modernizer is that I just go straight to their GitHub repo and I copy paste the particular feature detection that they have for whatever I'm using, right? So they do incremental builds, so you can totally do a build of Modernizer that only has a feature text you're interested in, but for some reason I just like to copy paste from them. You know, lots of different ways, but just consult that first. Check their issue trackers because they have lots of interesting discussions about the different things and issues that might come up, and you'll find out if there's actually something kind of up with that particular feature text. But go there first because that's where everybody is putting all their community resources into, right? So feature detection is really awesome when it works, right? Because you're like, wow, this is what I should be doing. I should be asking the browser if it supports it. But this doesn't always work. There is not always a way to ask the browser, right? Sometimes there's just nothing exposed that will tell you whether it works. So when it doesn't work, we have to use the horrible user agent sniffing, right? Which everyone's like, oh, God, no. That's how you react, right? So you know user agent sniffing, good old window navigator user agent, good old regex, and you're like, oh, am I on an iPhone or an iPad? Beautiful. That might be a really, really basic check there, right? Maybe if you wanted a more advanced check, you're checking for mobile browsers, right? Oh, you think this is bad? Just wait. If you wanted all mobile browsers, this is what your regex would look like, right? Wow. I'm sure those of you who enjoy regex are just really enjoying yourself right now. Yes.
For responsive, a lot of time they use screen size as a determinant. Can you use that to at least trim your tree down?
So the question is, can you use screen size to trim your tree down? Inappropriate. So, I mean, you can use screen size, but that is kind of relying on the fact that there happens to be a browser with those exact dimensions, and that if so, so if somebody comes up with, so I wouldn't really use that because what happens if they're then using Chrome on something with that particular size, right? So the browser is not the same as the hardware, so I would be wary of doing that, right? But depending on what you're doing, maybe it'll work, yeah? So user agent sniffing can get really nasty, especially if you're making up your own regex, right? So once again, other people have done this in the past. Unless you really get off on regex, don't try and do it, right? And I don't understand why you would do that. So what I'd recommend instead is to use the UA parser library. So once again, this is a community open source project that lots of people contribute to. It was created by BrowserStack, but it's used by Google, Facebook, lots of places. And it's got a really good approach in that it actually defines all the regexes in a YAML file, which is yet another markup language. And then it will generate libraries for all the different languages from that YAML, right? So automatically. So we'd have the same regexes in Python and JavaScript and PHP and Ruby and all that stuff, right? Because sometimes you do want to check this stuff on the server too. And then it's got a consistent API for accessing, you know, the family and the major and the minor version, all that stuff, right? So this is, if you are going to do user agent sniffing, I would recommend going here first and, you know, grabbing whatever port is best for you, or at least looking at their regexes.yaml to see what it is they're using, right? Because otherwise you will end up wrong, right? Like you might think that if you're detecting Chrome in the string, it's Chrome. But that's probably not true because you could actually be looking at an IE with Chrome frame installed, right? So I've had even very common user agent libraries fail on edge cases like that. And edge cases like IE with Chrome Frame actually matter quite a bit when you're serving something to users or debugging something. Okay. All right, so you can also mix and match, right? So I've had to do this quite a bit where I'd be like, all right, I'm going to do this for every device that is touch enabled, but not on Safari 4 because I happen to know that there is a bug on Safari 4 that means that this doesn't work. So one of the reasons that people really don't like user agent sniffing is because a lot of people use user agent sniffing to whitelist people into features and say, hey, you can only have this feature if you're on Chrome and IE because Firefox doesn't support it right now. But then if Firefox comes out the next day and does support it, then you've got users that can't use that feature for no good reason, right? Because you've whitelisted who can use that feature, right? As opposed to this approach where you're basically saying, like, all right, anyone can use it that has touch enabled, but if you happen to be on this browser that I have proven to not work, then you can't use it, right? Now, Safari's a little tricky because if I did Safari 4, major version 4, it's possible that maybe there's if this was when Safari 4 was out, maybe they'd come up with a new minor version that did fix it. But I'm not excluding too many users, right? And you could get more and more specific there. You could specify the major and the minor and greater than and less than a particular minor and all that stuff, right? So it is a little bit more future-proof than the technique of using user agent sniffing to whitelist people into a feature, right? Because especially with HTML5, these browsers are coming up with the support for the new features like pretty frequently, right? So there was a Firefox release last week that included support for input type equals range, right? And so you don't want to be sitting there, keeping track of when these features are suddenly supported. You ideally want your code to just kind of work when they do. Okay, so that was detection, right? So now, we've figured out that it doesn't work in someone's browser. So what are we going to fall back to? Because most of the time it isn't going to work in all browsers, so we need some strategy, right? So one thing is something called a shim. And a shim is basically a library that lets us use these new features in older browsers using some sort of fallback technology, right? So one example is the file API. So this is like if I wanted to have drag and drop, right? Drag and drop is awesome. And by the way, drag and drop is based on IE's implementation of drag and drop. So just so you know, you can't blame IE for not being cool, because IE actually invented a lot of the stuff we're using today. So, and by the way, HTML5 spec at the very bottom says thank you to IE for coming up with a lot of stuff. See, that's why you read specs. All right, anyway. So now I'm allowed to make fun of IE for the rest of the time. All right. If we want to do some drag and drop, the file API kind of makes up this way of doing it. It says, oh, okay, all right, if you want to listen to the drag and drop event, and when you get this over, you're going to do this and this and this, right? And you just read the documentation. You're like, oh, okay, that's how I'm going to do drag and drop. And behind the scenes, whoever wrote that library is going to make sure that it works in all the browsers that they claim it works in, right? So that's pretty cool. Even cooler is something called polyfills. All right, so a polyfill is a shim, but a shim that mimics the future interface of the API. So the idea behind a polyfill is that if we do things using polyfills, then at some point we can just take out the polyfill JavaScript and our feature works according to the current browser spec, right? So that's pretty cool because that's kind of the ultimate dream, right? Is that eventually we're using all native technology and we don't have any of these fallbacks in there. So people go through a lot of effort now to try and make things that are polyfills instead of just shims, so that you can have this kind of transparent switch out behind, right? The simplest example I could fit on a slide was for a new ECMAScript feature, or JavaScript. So JavaScript finally has a for each. And that's pretty cool because we can iterate over stuff in an array. This is something every other language has had for 50 years. But if we wanted to shim it, we can just say, OK, if for each is not defined on the array prototype, then we can just say array for each. And it's actually a pretty straightforward shim or polyfill here, right? So that's cool. And actually, if you go through the MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network docs, they have polyfills for pretty much every new ECMAScript feature. But really what you should use is ES5 shim or ES6 shim, because they will do it all for you as well. So if you're interested in writing a polyfill, there's various articles that actually tell you how, give you good advice for how do you write a polyfill, because it is a little tricky sometimes to figure out how to, mimic an API, but actually use something else behind the scenes. Yeah?
So you said use ES5 shim, ES6, where do you grab those from?
Good question. So, as I was saying, like, yeah, you shouldn't be making up these yourself most of the time because a lot of people have already done it because HTML5 has been around for a while. So we have a ton of resources, right? So the best one is the all-in-one, entirely not alphabetical, no bullshit guide to HTML5 fallbacks. So here we go. We see a long list of polyfills and shims. So SVG, Canvas, elements, videos, audio, web SQL, IndexedDB, forms. I don't know where my okay, I'm 30%. Geolocation. You know, you can do animated pings now. Awesome. Meter, all these new form elements, data set, data list, file API, WebRTC, WebGL, web audio. This is also a good list of everything you can do in HTML5. Post message, cores, pointer events, ECMAScript 5. Here we go. So there we go, ES5 shim. I was a colleague with him. Cool. And then ECMAScript 6 has an ES6 shim. And then we've got CSS stuff, lots of CSS stuff, lots of CSS, everything. And then there's everything. And you can contribute to this because it is a GitHub wiki, yeah? So there's a long list on here, and the ES shims are linked from here. But this is probably the first one to consult. You can certainly try Googling, you know, blah, blah, polyfill, blah, blah, shim, and you'll probably find some little Stack Overflow answer. But what I would do is I would go here. I would look at a project, right? So we go and like, all right, let's look at that ES5 shim, right? And we'll check it out. So then what I look at is I look at the number of stars and I look at the number of forks. So it approximately has a shitload. So that's good. It's also, let's look at recent activity 6 days ago. That's good, yeah, so it's a recently active project, especially important for HTML5 shims and polyfills because browsers are changing stuff all the time with these new APIs. So you definitely want to see something that's active. Also, what I also look at is issues, right? So 15 issues, wow, it only has 15 issues. 15 open, 152 closed, that's pretty cool too, right? That's a pretty good ratio, it doesn't have too many open ones. I also will look at an individual issue to see how douchey the maintainers are. Oh, actually, Kit's really cool. So, yeah, so I'm not sure if I'm going to find an example of, let's see, one comment. I agree. So Kit is awesome. So this looks like an amazing library, right? It's active. It's got a lot of people using it. It doesn't have that many issues. And the maintainers are really quite agreeable, right? That's what I want. So this is actually a perfect, you know, I randomly picked this too. That is a perfect library to use. So look at all that stuff. Also, of course, look at browser coverage. Some polyfills will specifically not support older browsers. Maybe they're only targeted for mobile. So take a look and see, does this actually work for the browsers that I'm particularly interested in? Because you'll find some people will purposely want to do something that involves like a lot of fallbacks, and some people are really just saying, hey, this is the lightweight version that you use when you're just doing like an Android iOS app, right? So that's pretty important too. So yeah. This is what you should look for first, and I think you'll find for quite a lot of features that there is going to be a polyfill and shim available, hopefully. All right, so the other alternative is when you're considering what to do for fallback is you could just not have the feature if it doesn't work in the browser, right? So particularly for stuff like CSS, right? A lot of CSS3 stuff is like, I'm sorry, if you visit our site in an old IE, it will be square. Right, and that's totally cool because that's like flat design now anyway, right? So they get like the new modern thing, right? So there's a lovely website. Do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser.com that espouses, you know, a really good explanation of this. There you go. So it's not worth the effort for some things to make them look exactly the same, right? Like you don't have a box shadow, the world will go on. It'll probably perform better in those older browsers too. You know, for some things you might consider just not using it, right? Particularly for styling things, right? You're not going to always get away with that. You could also tell the users, right? You could say, hey, if you want this feature, do this newer browser, right? So like I was just learning probability on Khan Academy, right? And they have a little speed up button. And I was like, I need this speed up because I'm so used to it on Coursera. Like I need to speed up every video I watch, even like music videos. And I clicked on the speed up and it said, oh, you're actually using the Flash player right now. If you want this, you have to go and opt into the HTML5 player instead and reload the page. And I was like, okay, done. I will do that, right? So that was kind of cool, is that they showed users that the option existed. And when you click it, it's like, oh, well, yeah, you can do this if you actually go and upgrade your browser or change your settings or something like that. So I thought that was kind of a cool thing to let people know that there is a path forward to this functionality if they want it, right? Because maybe they'll actually upgrade. You never know. Okay, all right. So that's our general strategy, right? So we research, we figure out how to detect and how to fall back. And that's the rough order that we should do things. We don't always do it in that order. So now I'm going to go through some like true stories, like Tales from the Crypt of, do you guys all watch that show when you were kids? Yeah. I was going to like, get the screen, but then I was like, oh, it's too scary. Some stories of some features that we've wanted at Coursera and what the process has been like with using those, right? So start with something simple. Our designer wanted us to have SVG logos, right? Because he had a Retina display machine, and he has like perfect eyesight. And when he looked at our logos, he's like, they're so blurry. And I was like, well, I can't see anything. But I was like, all right, fine. This is pretty straightforward. Let's do it. I believe you. So so we wanted SVG logos, which would mean that on any display, on any Zoom, we would get these nice crisp lines, right? So you research, right? And SVG is an interesting one because it's not just does SVG work, it's does SVG work in CSS backgrounds? Does SVG work as the image source? Does it work inline XML? Does it work as like an object SVG embedded? There's like 10 different variations on the ways you can use SVG inside a page, since it's not quite HTML, but it's like this image format, it's kind of in between. And then there's all these different features inside SVG itself that you could check on, right? But this is a pretty standard SVG file. And so I was just checking, does it work in CSS backgrounds, right? So it basically works. There is some bug where SVG images are blurry and scaled on Firefox. But since everything's blurry to me anyway, I was like, fine, whatever. So the way I did this, I actually didn't find the check that I needed in Modernizer. I found it in a different blog post about this particular technique. But I put in my detection in a little util library that actually it checks this document.implementation object, and that'll end up telling us if it'll work. And so then I add the supports SVG class to the main root element of the document. And then once I've done that, I can then start off. So here, it's not really a fallback. It's like a fall forward or whatever. But I start off with my normal ping defined as the background of the logo. And then I say, OK, if we are in a browser that supports SVG, then we serve the SVG logo instead. Right? And there's a whole blog post about doing this in particular. So it's probably like the easiest way that you could please your designer tomorrow if you just go home and do this. So this was really straightforward, right? And it worked fine, and there were no issues with it. Most of the time, there are issues. So now we're going to talk about issues. All right, so we wanted rich text areas, right? Because we have all these places on our site where users want to give us rich text, right? We have discussion forums. We've got these admin interfaces. It's like on 20% of our site, right? So we were using, what is it? You guys know what I'm talking about. No, the one that starts with T.
TinyMCE?
Thank you. Yeah, I knew you knew it. Yeah, oh, now you're not going to get the unicorn. Come on. So yeah, we were using TinyMCE, but didn't love it. TinyMCE is it's an HTML editor, it's a rich text editor. It's been around for a while, and we weren't in love with it, and it wasn't the most extensible, and had some issues. So I was like, oh, we'll just use something new. We'll use something more modern, right? We're like, all right, we want a modern text area that uses modern technologies, yeah? So then we had to look at like, all right, how can we do this in modern HTML5, right? So what does HTML5 have? So we have text areas, but that's not going to give us anything because we don't have anything rich. We do have this thing called content editable, and you can put content editable as an attribute on anything. All right, so I'm actually typing inside a content editable div right now. I could delete it and all that stuff. It's actually got, if you look at it, I'm not going to delete this because I'm showing this to you. It's got really good support, right? It's all the way back, even IE8 has it, right? So that's pretty neat. So I was like, okay, this is cool, this is cool. We can kind of do this rich text thing, but we don't have any buttons, right? When you're making a rich text area, you want buttons so that people can click them, and they can say, oh, now I want to go bold, now I want to go italic. And then you also want keyboard shortcuts, right? So basically, there is nothing in HTML5 which is like a rich text area element. So it's like, all right, there's actually quite a bit of work that you have to go through to make this rich text area element with a toolbar and keyboard accessibility and all of that. So I decided that I was not going to reinvent the wheel, and I went looking for a library, right? So I went and found Wizzy HTML5, right? So Wizzy HTML5, it says open source rich text editor based on HTML5 technology and progressive enhancement approach. And it had great browser support, right? All the browsers that we cared about. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. And behind the scenes, it uses content editable, right? Because this is the kind of the best way to do something like that in modern browsers. So I was like, this is so cool. Yay, this is going to be amazing, right? So let's just look at how Wizzy HTML5 does things, right? So in this case, this is all Wizzy HTML5 code. I'm just giving you a look inside their code to kind of show you how crazy it is so you don't think about doing it. All right? So this is their function to check if content editable is supported, right? So they check to see if content editable is an attribute of an element, all right? So that's kind of your bare query. But then they check this thing to see if exec command exists on the document, and also they have these query command supported things that they check for. That has something to do with, I think, mutation events, something crazy. And then we check for query selector and query selector all. You guys probably know that. And then finally, we check to see if it's an incompatible mobile browser, right? So this is what I'm talking about, feature detection first and then blacklisting bad browsers. So it basically says content editable is unusable in some mobile browsers, right? And then so finally, whether it's going to do this is based on all of this stuff, right? So that simply dictates whether Wizzy HTML5 uses a text area or a content editable div, because the whole idea of Wizzy HTML5 is that it backs down to a text area if it can't do this. But the crazy thing is that it also has all of these functions here for checking little other things that it supports as well, right? So it's like, does it throw the mixed content warning when the iframe source is empty? Does it insert line breaks on return? Does it auto scroll to caret? Does it clear list and content editable correctly? Can it select images in content editable? These are all feature detection functions. It has like 50 feature detection functions inside its code base in order to figure out little things about the way it works inside, right? So yes, this will tell us if it roughly works. And all this information here will tell it how to act in particular places, right? So it's got quite a complex code base in order to work around all the different ways that browsers support content editable, right? So this is one of the points to really get across, is that it's not just as simple as checking to see if something works. There's all the different ways that something can work, and you will have to work around all those different ways as well if you intend to use one of these new features, right? Especially something complex like content editable. Now, for actually using Wizzy HTML5 and how it works, you create a text area, and then you say, oh, create a new text area around this, and then Wizzy HTML5 will just say, okay, if it's not compatible, then we're just going to return. Otherwise, it'll go on to make its whole view full rich view, right? But it's quite a complex code base, so I recommend reading that on Saturday nights. So what I learned from this here, and you'll see in a second, is that this content editable is a bit finicky, right? So what happens is, so I rewrote all of our text areas to use Wizzy HTML5, and it looked really cool on my Chrome and on my Firefox, and I was like, this is awesome. And I pushed out our new forums, and then I get the next day just all these people on their iPads going, I can't use this. Crazy things are happening. My carrots are going everywhere. And they were freaking out, right? They were literally using all caps, right? Because what I've learned about users is that they use all caps. I screenshotted the nice one who was like giving like a little like ordered list of all the things to do, and I much appreciated his post, right? It was much less stressful than the 100 other all caps posts. So basically what happened is that there was an issue in iPad with Content Editable where it actually, like according to WYSI HTML5, iPad should work, but because of some strange interaction with the fact that we had a scrolling page and the fact that we had different events bound or something like that, it wasn't working, and it was really, really hard for users to type, right? And people were freaking out because they basically felt like they couldn't contribute to conversations, and that basically meant that this part of the forums were unusable, right? So I couldn't figure out, like, okay, so I'll tell you this, debugging carrots is really, really hard. When I say carrots, I mean like the little thingy there, right? Not just, so debugging carrots is really hard. Like when I worked 2 years ago on a PhoneGap app, I once spent a week debugging an issue with carrots on the Android browser where like the carrot wouldn't go to the right place. And it's very hard to debug because you can't emulate it. It's only going to happen on the exact device. And there's not that much programmatic debugging support for carrot location, right? So when something weird happens with carrots, you are going to spend a long time debugging it, right? So I already learned that dealing with carrot issues was not something I wanted to do. So I was like, all right, what can I do instead? I was like, well, I could just always serve iPad users a text area, right? So that's what I did. I was like, yay, you get a text area. They didn't really like that much. They wanted to be able to express their boldness and their new lines, right? New lines are a big thing too. And I was like, all right, well, what's one way I could do that? I was like, well, I could just let them do Markdown, right? Because Markdown, it would take care of turning new lines into BRs, and you could just do it with a text area. And of course, every programmer in the world loves Markdown, so I also had all these programmers that were begging me to give Markdown back. So I spent the next week implementing a Markdown mode for this editor, right? Which would actually just convert to HTML behind the scenes. And so then what I have in the code is like, okay, if it's iOS, we always give them Markdown, right? Because basically we've determined that for whatever reason, Content Editable has too many issues on iOS, and they are beyond the reach of my puny human brain to figure out. So we give them Markdown, right? But this was really kind of upsetting for us, because it was like, wow, we were going to have this new modern experience, and we weren't able to due to just weird issues in Content Editable, right? And I spent a while just looking through WebKit bugs, trying to figure out which WebKit bug it was, because when you look into it, you will start to see, oh yeah, there are people talking about strange stuff in Content Editable on an iPad, right? But that's when you really start to look into it, right? So yeah, so what did we learn here? Like, features like Content Editable, they're really subtle. They can break in really subtle ways, and you have to be very, very careful when you use them. So that wasn't the most pleasant experience. But let's go to videos, right? So basically the main thing that people do on Coursera is they watch videos, right, of the lectures. Here's my favorite, Dan Ariely. We've got videos, we've got subtitles. Subtitles are actually something that we need to have because we're obligated by contract to have them because you need them for accessibility reasons. So we wanted to be able to play videos across multiple browsers, which includes browsers where Flash doesn't work, like iPad, because we actually have like 10% of users on iPad. And we also needed subtitle support, right? So we started to look into it. All right, if you look at the video tag and you look at its support tables, you'll see pretty decent support, right? So we see IE8 doesn't have it, but you could think to yourself like, oh, okay, well, we could just use Flash on IE8, right? And that's not even that many users for us. So that's cool, but then you look at the HTML spec, and you see in the HTML spec, they said it would be helpful for interoperability if all browsers could support the same codecs. However, there are no known codecs that satisfy all the current players. We need a codec that's known to not require per unit or per distributed licensing, that's compatible with the open source development model, that is of sufficient quantity to be usable, and is not an additional submarine patent risk for large companies. I don't even know what a patent risk or submarine patent is. But basically the point is that the HTML5 spec editors couldn't come up with a codec that they could reasonably recommend to every browser. So they said, do your own thing, right? So the browsers did their own thing. So that means you have to look up video codec support too to make sure that you're going to output your videos in all the required formats. So if you look at this lovely table here from Wikipedia, you will notice that there is no column that is green all the way down, which means there is no format that works in every browser, right? Some of them with Fiora, some with H.264, some with WebM. So that means you will always have to output your videos in at least 2 formats to get them to work across all the browsers. So we're going with, I think we have WebM and MP4, or H.264 right now, because that will get us all of the browsers, right? So that makes life interesting as well. But then there's also all these features of the video tag, right? So there's a lot of browsers that support the video tag, but what about the actual different things that we could do with it, right? Because there's quite a bit of things. So the thing that we are really concerned about is the track tag. That's what lets you specify subtitles. So if you look at this other chart for it from longtailvideo.com, we can see that there's not very good support for the track tag, right? According to this, there's basically none in Firefox or iOS or Android, right? So that means that we are going to have to come up with our own way of overlaying subtitles in those browsers. So after you do all this research, you think to yourself, right, I don't want to really deal with any of that, right? That seems really complicated. Luckily, people have already come up with approaches to this, right? So there's quite a few wrappers for HTML5 video tag, right? So list of them here, Video.js, Leanback, Captionator, etc. So we went with Media Element.js, and this was like a year and a half ago when they were starting Coursera, because it seemed to have everything we needed, right? So we needed a Flash fallback, we needed support for tracks, and we also needed to be extendable, because there's a lot of other things that our videos do too, like we overlay the video quizzes, we have this like slide thing on the side where you can sync the slides to the video and all this stuff. So we needed to be able to build on top of it. So if we look at Media Element.js, once again, I'll just give you a little insight into what it's like to detect things inside a video library, right? So on the video tag, we have this lovely attribute, CanPlayType. So CanPlayType will return probably, maybe, no, or empty string. And this is a real spec. This is a real thing that somebody came up with, because they decided that was the best way. So basically what you do is you pass it a type of file. You say, OK, I have an MP4. Can you say it? Can you serve it? And then they say back, probably, or maybe, no. And actually, it's not even no anymore. So now empty string actually means no, but you still have to check for no, because it's no in the older browsers. I kind of thought no was better. So this is kind of a weird API, but OK, we're going to use it, right? So in Media Element.js, first we have a hack for Android. I love this. Media Element.js has an actual property, which is busted Android, right? I feel it's kind of redundant, right? Like you could just say is Android. I'm not sure if there's a distinction, but OK. So there oh, remember what this is? This is a polyfill, right? So they polyfill CanPlayType if we're on a busted Android, and have it return based on the things that they know that an Android can show, right? Which could be wrong in the future, but hey, you got to do what you got to do. All right, and then they go through, because you can have multiple source files, so they go through each of the source files, and they'll check to see if CanPlayType basically equals to an empty string, or does not equal to an empty string. And then they also have to special case this one thing in Safari 5.0.3, of course. And so after this, they can determine whether the video element can actually play the type that you've given it in that browser, right? And then if that browser can't play that video type, it'll go and fall back to Flash instead. So for falling back to Flash, it comes with its own little Swift file, and it'll serve a Swift file, and that Swift file will play the video instead, right? So hopefully you've actually given it a format that does work on iPad, since the Flash isn't going to work, right? And it also has Silverlight fallbacks, in case anybody uses Silverlight. I think that's the main ones. Oh, and YouTube, actually. We've got YouTube in there, too, if you wanted to host on YouTube. And YouTube would do its own fallback. So you have like a library that's wrapping on top of a library which has its own fallbacks, and crazy stuff happens. So yeah, so if we want to actually use this library, we'll create a video tag. We have our multiple sources. We have our track tag. And then we pass this into the media element player and make it. All right? All of these snippets are highly simplified. I recommend actually browsing the code if you like have dinner that you're trying to vomit or something. And you'll see that it's quite a bit longer, but I have to cut it down to fit on slides, right? We've got probably, I don't know, 500 or 1,000 lines of code that actually wraps on top of this little bit here, right? But I couldn't fit that all. All right, so what I've learned with this thing is that when you've got fallbacks, that means you have double technology, which basically means you have double any trouble you would normally have with technology, right? So that means that anytime we make a change to video, it takes twice as long for our QA team to test it, because they need to test Flash and HTML5, right? It means we get twice the bug reports from students, and every time we get a bug report, we have to very explicitly ask them, like, hey, was it HTML5 or was it Flash? All right, otherwise it's very hard to debug. And it's just twice the maintenance burden, right? Because if something suddenly happens with Flash tomorrow, or suddenly something happens with the video tag tomorrow, we have to take care of that, right? And we have other things that we'd like to do instead of just maintain these videos all day. But it turns out shit happens. So what happens? All right, so this happened quite recently, and I apologize to those of you suffering from it right now. But basically, Chrome 25 came out, or Chrome 27 came out, and in that version, our videos were no longer loading, right? We literally did not touch our video code whatsoever, but something about Chrome's internals changed in such a way that our videos stopped loading. Some people noticed this in Chrome Canary, but sometimes things get fixed. But now it's actually in Chrome Stable, and we've got tons of users that are freaking out and going, the videos aren't loading. And as much as I've been tweeting at the Chrome team to fix it, they're not fixing it. So we have to fix it instead, right? So we have to come up with some workaround. So I spent 4 hours on Monday commenting out lines out of an 800-line file until our videos worked. And I got it. But it wasn't the most pleasant afternoon. So yeah, that can happen, right? So suddenly, in the middle of us trying to work on new features, it's like, oh, guess what? Something about Chrome changed, and your feature which worked before didn't work before, right? This is what can happen when you're using new technology, right? Subtle things will change about the browsers, and your stuff won't work anymore, right? Now, unfortunately, even old technology can be bad, right? So Flash, unfortunately, gets security issues from time to time, and people found an XSS vulnerability in this media element library. So when that happened, we had to upgrade the whole library and the Flash and all of that stuff instead, and that also took several days of time because we had to have QA go through and do several nights of QA, right? So that's not good. And then the thing is, we have this detection where we think we're serving what the user can see, but it's the same, we don't always tell, right? There's nothing that we can do to programmatically detect the fact that that Chrome video isn't really loading. Okay, maybe there's something we can do, right? But weird stuff will happen with HTML5 video. It works in, it breaks in weird ways, right? Maybe the audio is slightly off. Maybe it's kind of pixelated, right? And so it's really hard for us to detect all those things. So we have to give the users tons of options to change. So we have it on the video lecture page where it says, okay, if you're having trouble, maybe you should change players, and we have a little button there. We've moved it onto the player itself. And honestly, at this point, we're thinking of just making it really freaking obvious, just have the giant thing that says, look, just click it. Because this is the #1 reports that we get from people is the problems with videos. And most of the time, it's fixed by going to Flash. So my colleague actually wants us just to default to Flash, which I'm really tempted to do. Because Flash at least has less issues than the HTML5 player, right? And if they wanted to be all adventurous, they could go to HTML5, right? Yeah?
Is there any way to do sort of an existential test, like try to play a video in a hidden frame and observe it streaming, and if it doesn't stream past a certain point, do a switch?
Yeah, so can you do an existential test, check to see if it streams? I think you could totally do that. Question as to whether I want to go to the effort to do it, because I think that will if we did that, if we tried to see, if we try to detect the fact that it's doing that infinite loading thing, I bet we could find a way to detect that by checking how many bytes have gone by. But I don't know if we'd be able to detect everything, right? Because that's the issue we're facing this week. But next week it could be sound out of sync, right? I'm not sure how I would detect that. It could be little pixelation issues. Okay, I have to render to a canvas tag and detect blocks of pixels. So I think some of them you could detect, but not everything. Some of these things are weird. So those are just a sampling of stories. I have a whole other talk which has 5 other stories in it, but The idea is just to give you a taste of what can happen, right? And I know that I'm not always like the most pleasant in my stories. So it's not that I want to like scare people, right? If I was like an HTML5 evangelist, I'd probably get fired. But I want everyone to be forewarned, right? That these things can happen, that it's not all, you know, shiny, happy roses, right? Because these HTML5 features are really, really tempting, right? And you look at them and you think, oh my God, you know, everything's going to be so much easier with this feature. But then, you know, when you start to use it, these weird things can happen. They can break in weird ways, and you can end up going through a lot of effort because you decided to make that decision to go with this new technology, right? So I would suggest that, you know, when you're thinking about using these HTML5 features, do you have the time, right? It is going to take you time. You're going to have to research. You're going to have to evaluate different polyfills and shims to use. You're going to have to maintain it afterwards, right? Saying like the maintenance version can be big. Do you have the resources, right? One of the problems with that WYSI HTML5 issue is that I was not set up for debugging on an iPad, right? Because we'd never had iPad issues before that day. So it wasn't something that I had a whole, you know, when you're doing mobile debugging, like you have a whole mobile setup, right? I didn't have that setup because we hadn't had mobile issues before. So it took me a week just to get an iPad set up in such a way that I could actually test this issue. And then getting it set up so I could test locally and do fast reloads and all that stuff, that took another few days. So, you know, there's the resources to actually check that these things work and to have QA that can make sure that they're working in all your browsers. And do you want to be the pioneer, right? Because some of these things, you're going to be the first one to try and go down that route. And yeah, there's lots, I said there's lots of polyfills and people have invented the wheel, but they may not have used that polyfill for the particular usage that you're using it for, right? So it might work great for their usage and it probably looks fantastic on their demo page, but when you start to integrate in your app and you have your particular users using it inside your UI, there might be something about it where it doesn't work and it could just fall down completely, right? So you're going to have to be the pioneer there that figures out why it doesn't work and comes up with the patch and documents it and then, you know, gives a lightning talk about it here and all that stuff, right? And so you have to be willing to be that pioneer if you're going to take these things on. And you can totally do it. It's kind of fun, right? It's like, I'm going to traipse into new land. I'm going to be able to put my little flag here. And it's cool. But I wouldn't recommend being the pioneer of everything, right? Because at some point you probably are trying to get a feature out to users, and your users, they kind of just want the feature, right? They don't really care that much that, you know, you managed to fix this one bug that you know, nobody else was able to fix, right? So you kind of, I think, you know, we kind of balance in web development, like, okay, are we going to use the tried and true technique here? Are we going to try something a little different, a little crazy, and, you know, maybe we'll be willing to put the time into this one, right? And you can totally opt to go for, you know, kind of balance and opt to go for the crazy sometimes because that's fun, right? And it's like a little scavenger hunt. And do you have an alternative? All right, sometimes you just don't have an alternative, right? We pretty much have to use HTML5 video tag because we don't have any other options on iPad, right? So we're going to have to make it work somehow, right? So, you know, maybe there's a different way a different library we could use, but we're basically going to have to use that video tag somehow, right? So you have to consider what your alternatives are. But yeah, by all means, go for it. Try it out. Good luck, and I hope that whatever you find, document it, right? If you find something, write a blog post, submit a pull request with your fixes, file an issue on WebKit or the Android tracker that says this is busted. I file so many issues on the Android tracker, they probably have me on a blacklist, right? So just share what you learn, because in HTML5, like, we're all, you know, everything is changing so much, so there's all this new stuff to learn all the time. So it's kind of up to us to document that and share it with the rest of the community as we go along, right? So that's it. Thank you. Questions?
More of a compliment than you're trying to add to the video playback.
Right, so that's a good question. So when it comes to the HTML5 versus Flash for the video, is it due to the browser or is it due to the features? I do believe it's due to the features we're using, since we actually only get the issue with when we're using subtitles. So it has something to do with subtitles. It has something to do with the wrapper library you're using. And so in order to figure out what it is that's actually going on, I would have to reach inside that wrapper library and debug that, right? So I commented out as many lines of code I could in our code to try and see if that would get rid of the issue. And I was hoping that I wouldn't have to also comment out every line in the media element code too, right? Because when we did find that issue, the first thing we did was that we created a test page with just the video tag without media element JS, with exactly the same sources and tracks. Worked fine. So it has something to do with the wrappers on top of the wrappers, right? But figuring out where is hard. So it is something to be aware of when you use these wrapper libraries. So when you're looking at these wrapper libraries, the final thing that I didn't do was look at the code, right? Because at some point, you will have to look at the code. And if that shit's nasty, you are going to be sad, right? So look at the code and see, is this written in a way that I would feel comfortable going into it and, trying to debug it, right? Because I think that the vast majority of the time that I've used a wrapper library, I have gone into the code. And sometimes it's made me very afraid. Yeah.
How do you do it?
Okay, so the question is, how do you balance your day job with also, I guess, like contributing back to community and keeping track of everything going on in the world? So I was saying, actually, I don't keep track of anything going on in the world, but the web world, yeah. So first of all, yeah, stop paying attention to politics. That is really complicated stuff. So the only news I subscribe to is the Cooper Press newsletters, right? You could actually turn off Hacker News and Twitter and all that stuff, and you would find out about all the top links basically from those newsletters. So, and that only takes me so I'll get those newsletters once a week, and I'll just open up 10 of the links, I'll give them a look-see, and I was like, cool. I'm on board. I get what's going on there. So I think that's a really nice way of keeping on track. In terms of contributing back, yeah. So I have this compulsion to write blog posts, which is kind of bad, but maybe kind of good too. But it takes time to do stuff like write blog posts or write entire open source libraries. But there are easy ways to do stuff. So gist something, all right? Gists are great. They're really low barrier to contributing back, and they're totally SEO'd too. So if you find some hack or something like that, just do a gist that says workaround for busted Android and Continental, right? All right, and somebody might find it, right? I've found lots of solutions off of GIST, and I've been really, really helpful for people who have put that out there, right? And it can be just two-liner GIST, right? So I think that's a good way of starting to give back, and and just doing stuff like when you're on an open source repo, if you see a typo in the docs or something wrong in the docs, just edit that right there, right? That's a really easy way of giving back. So I think you can start with these kind of low barriers, yeah. Okay, so the question is, did we consider putting subtitles in the server side? How would we do that? What do you mean by server side? Oh, baking it into the video? Yeah. We've got 20 different languages for some of them, so we'd have to have a ton of videos for that, and we'd have to have a service for doing that. So right now we're using Transloadit that does all of our encoding, and that's really cool. But I don't know if they would bake it in. And that means you'd have to have so many options. So video cost and video transcoding cost is quite a lot of money. So I think it would be kind of unreasonable in the number of videos we would need to support all the different languages we might support. But if it was just English, that'd be cool, maybe.
Well, subtitles to turn on and off.
Yeah, you can turn them on and off. So you'd have to switch between the videos back and forth, but. You could always decide everybody gets subtitles, right? I like dating foreign boys because then I can put the subtitles on and pretend it's for them because I really like subtitles because I can't understand anything.
What about
So, all right, so the question is on the testing process. All right, so for our tests, we actually, for the front end, we use JS DOM. JS DOM is not a real DOM, so it allows us to test things like interactions of events with other, with visibility and with mock AJAX requests and stuff like that. It does not actually run inside a browser, so it does not catch any browser issues. So we do not catch browser issues with our automated tests. We have written Selenium tests in the past, and Selenium tests, they open up an entire browser, and then they're like remote-controlled browser, and that's like a full integration test. However, our Selenium tests have been quite flaky, and we haven't had the time to actually maintain the Selenium tests and make them not flaky. And they also take a long time to run, right? So we wouldn't be able to run our Selenium tests as much as we can run the other ones, right? We can run 400 JS DOM tests in like 2 minutes. Right? We could never achieve that with Selenium unless we put it across many different clouds, which you can do. You can use stuff like Sauce Labs, and that'll parallelize your Selenium tests and stuff like that. So we could certainly look into doing, I think that's the ideal one day is you have, so the ideal thing is you have cross-browser Selenium tests for your most important things like lectures. You have all these unit tests that run really fast. And then what I really want is visual regression testing, right, is when we change something about our CSS, if that suddenly changed the way something looks somewhere on the site, you can actually take a screenshot and do a diff and get an alert that says, hey, something changed about your visual stuff, right? Because little changes in CSS have really bitten us quite badly. So I think that's kind of like this ideal stack, but it takes time to build up that stack. So right now, we just have the JS DOM unit tests, and we have a QA team that will test new features and changes and catch things that way, hopefully.
How many different platforms do you force in your QA team?
So the question is, how many platforms does our QA team do? So we ask them to test IE 9 and 10, Firefox, Chrome, and Chrome. So for Chrome and Firefox, it's on Windows and Mac. We also ask them to test iPad when they have time because we have a lot of users there. And I've actually noticed that iPad is an environment where you are likely to get bugs that you wouldn't see elsewhere. So I think it's really valuable to test an iPad because just weird stuff happens. And that's what they test in most of the time. And saying that definitely does take time. Oh, and even Chrome on Ubuntu because we have kind of a programmer crowd too. Yeah, we don't, so for older browsers, so for IE8, we don't formally support it. I actually throw up a banner that says, hey, you're in IE8, you should probably get out of IE8, it's not a good place. And if you go to like Coursera.org in IE8, I throw out the banner. In IE7, I just don't let you in. I'm like, sorry, dude, you gotta go. At a certain point, right? It just won't even work.
So I'm not hearing any of the mobile phones or Android.
Yeah, so so I'm saying for our video tests, we do sometimes ask them to check Android tablets because there are enough people using Android tablets for videos, but we're doing it largely based on what our users are using now, right? So if you look at it, it's largely Chrome, Firefox, Android. We do test the IEs because the professors tend to use IE. And then there are a few people on Android tablets. So specifically for video, we might test that, but not for the other stuff. No, so UA parser has the regexes.yaml, and then it automatically gets output in client libraries in like 8 different languages. So you can use it from Python, Ruby, wherever.
Can you use it on the server side yourself? Use it at all?
Honestly, I've actually never used it, but when I gave something like this talk before, Paul Irish was like, you got to get them to use UA parser. I was like, okay, right? So I've never used it, but I've been told I really, really should. So pretend that I use it, okay? Don't tell Paul.
Cool. Any final questions?